This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Student loan debt is front and center these days as advocates push for greater forgiveness for people who have gone into public service fields like teaching, and for individuals who may have signed up for bad loans based on predatory lending practices. Joining us today is data journalist Andrea Fuller of the Wall Street Journal. She's been tackling this story from just about every angle with her colleagues at the newspaper. That includes investigations into questionable practices in big-name schools, including Baylor University and the University of Southern California. Andrea, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
A lot of your work centers around this question that's getting a lot of attention these days, which is whether higher education is worth it. On one hand, that seems like something individuals have to answer for themselves, but you and the rest of the team at the Wall Street Journal have come up with your own metrics for weighing this. So I'm wondering, how did you decide how to determine the value of higher education programs?
So what we looked at for every program in the country using this data that the education department releases through its College Scorecard was what's called a debt to income ratio. What that actually means is your debt load at graduation compared to your income 2 years out. It's a pretty simple metric, just divide. And experts say that you shouldn't be borrowing more in most cases than you're going to earn 2 years out. Not a universal rule. For example, doctors are in residency 2 years out. Their salaries will be much higher later.
What you're talking about is a return on investment within a set number of years?
Correct. We only have data from the education department for the first 2 years. We don't have long-term data. So we're using what's publicly available. But using that, we found that a lot of programs, graduate programs in particular, have really high debt to income ratios. They have really high debt loads compared to earnings, more so than undergrad. I think with undergrad, we've had a lot of conversations about particularly for-profit education, some of the practices associated with that industry. And there hasn't been as much discussion about graduate education and the debt associated there, and the debt also that parents take on. That's another piece of it. And what's fueling all of this are what is known as plus loans, grad plus and parent plus. Undergraduates, they can only borrow a set amount. You're capped. Beyond that, their parents can take out loans. Graduate students can take out loans up to the cost of tuition, living, books, and other expenses. And so we've talked to a number of people with $300,000 plus in student loans.
You focused on the high debt loads, and you found some outlier programs. As we mentioned in the intro, USC's graduate program in social work got your attention. How did you identify those problem cases?
One of the things we were really interested in is the ways in which elite schools perpetuate this problem. We have schools like USC and Columbia that had really high debt to income ratios. And I think that's surprising for a lot of people. I think a lot of people think if you go to a brand name school, if you go to an Ivy League school, it's a gateway to higher earnings. And that is true in a lot of cases, but it's also not true universally. And so some of these programs, whether it be film school or whether it be USC's social work program, have really high six-figure debt loads compared to low to mid five-figure earnings.
So you found specifically for USC that there were people, for example, who may owe over $100,000 for the tuition, but they'll be lucky if they're going to crack $50,000 in salary.
Correct. We talked to people one recent graduate was making about $17 an hour. We talked to people making in the $50,000 ballpark. And that's not by any measure a bad salary, but it's impossible to pay off $200,000, $300,000 worth of debt on that salary. The tuition alone for that program was $115,000 over 2 years. And adding on cost of living and books and other expenses, people were borrowing $200,000, and it was really out of whack with what they could ever realistically pay off.
This jumped out to me in your reporting. You wrote that at California State University, Long Beach, and Los Angeles County, graduates borrowed less than a third of USC students and earned a median of about $59,000 2 years later. And that was 14% better than the USC students. I'm wondering, is some of this about access? If somebody wants to go be a social worker, I mean, I've certainly met students who went into huge debt for things like nursing programs because they just couldn't take the time to wait on the waiting list to get into one of the more affordable programs at a community college.
That certainly may be a part of it. I talked to people who got into USC and they were surprised because they were waitlisted at state schools or rejected from state schools or schools that had far less brand recognition than USC did. USC doesn't reveal their acceptance rate for its online master's program. Important saying that this master's program is largely online. Just anecdotally, I talked to a lot of people who were rejected from other programs. Part of it also, I think, is just the dream school mentality. I think that people think, I would never get in a school like USC or Columbia, which is an Ivy League school, and they're enchanted by being admitted, kind of thinking about undergraduate admissions as this barometer of, oh, it's really, really selective. And so people take it on because they think it's going to be a ticket to the life that they want. And they think it'll give them an earnings premium, when in reality, we found that more than a dozen state schools in California have higher earnings than USC in the social work field.
Enchanted is a really powerful word right there, because in some of these cases, these students never went looking for this elite school. The school went looking for them. Is that right?
That's correct. Now, this would be the case with USC. When we've written about Columbia, we've written about law school, and then we've written about Baylor's undergraduate program. For the most part, those have a pretty traditional admissions process. You know, Columbia was turning away people in droves from its film program. With USC, it's different. There was a lot of marketing. People were being, I actually put in my own information and just, entered my email in a form on their website. And I started getting that same day phone calls from recruiters leaving me voicemails. I got half a dozen phone calls and several dozen emails over the next month. And it's pretty aggressive marketing strategy compared to, oh, here's a flyer, just, if you're interested. And I think students that we talked to were really wooed by that because they thought USC really wants me. In reality, USC contracts with this company to you that essentially sort of outsources a lot of these recruiting practices. And then USC is in charge of actual admissions.
There was a lot of questionable materials attached to some of these marketing campaigns, both external and internal, as you reported, including the use of, I guess I would describe them as cartoon amalgams of different kinds of students that they should be looking for, or assumptions they might make about somebody based on their ethnicity or socioeconomic background or their academic standing. I'm wondering, what has been the response to this reporting from USC?
Well, I can tell you the response from students and readers has been sheer outrage. USC says they don't use these profiles anymore, that this was done under a previous team a couple years ago, before 2016, and that they would never use this today. However, just to elaborate on what these profiles are, there was a Black woman who was nicknamed Needy Nellie, who they described as being high need and had a lot of questions. There was a Latina student named Confirm Carmen who said USC was my dream school. There was Military Mike who wanted veterans benefits. And then there was Money Molly, who was a white applicant who had a 4.0 and could go to school anywhere she wanted. So needless to say, these profiles were played into some unfortunate stereotypes.
I think that's a fair way to say it. One of the tensions here, I think, for probably for people who are thinking about college, but also for people who report on them, is we know there's a lot of research that says if you are undereducated and in the job market, as well as in things like healthcare access and other aspects of life quality, you're less likely to get what you want if you don't have a college degree, that college can open doors to a higher quality of life for a lot of people. So I'm wondering, when you're reporting on this, what steps are you taking to make sure that your stories don't contribute to a narrative of college is never worth it?
Absolutely. I think that's a good question. Ultimately, you're right. Every bit of higher education on average leads to an earnings premium. Having an undergraduate degree, having a graduate degree, there's an earnings premium associated with that. What I think we want readers to take away is that not every graduate degree is worth it. It's okay to go to a state school, and in some cases, you may be better off than going to the expensive program. With Baylor, I think a lot of students, we wrote about their undergraduate program and the amount of debt that poor families were taking on. And it's people really wanted to go to Baylor because it's a prestigious private school. And some of them graduated thinking, well, was this really worth it? I loved my experience at Baylor. I had a great time at Baylor, but financially, maybe I'd have been better off going somewhere cheaper. I think that's true for the graduate programs as well. People think with, USC and social work, they think, oh my goodness, I could have earned the same thing as my friend sitting across the hall, and she went to a Cal State school. And that's, I think, what we want to inform people is that the brand recognition doesn't always yield financial rewards.
You've teamed up with several reporters from the Wall Street Journal to look at a variety of student loan debt issues. For example, Lisa Bannon was your collaborator on this fantastic piece on USC, and Tonnell Hobbs on the school and Baylor University. You've also worked with Melissa Korn, both of those reporters, of course, longtime EWA education journalists. How did you approach organizing this series? Were there specific aspects or experiences you knew you wanted to include at the outset?
Well, I have to thank my wonderful editor, Jennifer Forsyth, for a lot of the organization on this. She really brought this team together. These stories take an incredible amount of work and research and reporting. And gosh, for the USC story alone, I interviewed more than 30 students, and Lisa did who knows how many more interviews. Melissa and Tonnell are longtime education reporters, deeply informed and knowledgeable about education. So it was a really great collaborative experience. I think from my perspective as a data journalist, but also someone who calls and talks to people and writes about what they say, I had to be involved in every story from the data perspective. So it's a little bit like I would like to clone myself if that's available from Santa as a Christmas present this year. But we've really all been kind of working together to make the data and the narrative work together and to do these investigations. And I don't think it would have been possible without this huge team.
What's missing from your analysis? What do you wish you could add to the metrics that you had?
Oh, that's a great question. I would like longer term data. I would like to know a little bit more about 5 years out, what's the salary? I think a lot of schools, their pushback is, oh, this is early, that's going to change. That's true in some cases. I mentioned medical school, but not in others. I think it would be much more powerful to have more recent data. And I haven't mentioned repayment rates, but the education department lists repayment rates for 2 years out. How many people have actively started paying down their loans? And that's very low in a lot of cases, in part because of people are in income-based repayment plans, and the payment is very low in the first year because you're not working a full year. I'd like to see those numbers a few years out, and that data will eventually be available.
We're talking with Andrea Fuller of the Wall Street Journal about digging into the data on student loan debt. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you to everyone who has taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback are helping us to grow. I did want to mention we have opened registration, early registration for EWA's 75th National Seminar. We will be in Orlando, Florida, July 24th to 26th, 2022. Look forward to seeing you there in the sunshine. Andrea, tell me, what does a data reporter do at the Wall Street Journal? What's your job like?
I'm sort of a jack of all trades, master of a few. I look for stories in data analysis. I will say, not to toot my own horn by any means, all of these stories came from my data analysis. We didn't say, let's write about USC and see what data there is about it. I noticed in the data that USC had far, far, far more borrowers than most other graduate programs. And I didn't actually know anything about USC's social work program going in. And it completely surprised me that USC had this huge social work program with thousands of graduates. With Baylor, we focused on Baylor because of its low repayment rate for parent borrowers. So it's finding stories in the data like that. Columbia being the biggest outlier, where it has the highest debt to income ratio of any master's program at any major university. And so I'm always trying to identify stories. I'm doing analysis. I'm talking to experts, people who've worked in the administration before, people who at think tanks, often those overlap, academics, talking about student debt and about data. For other projects, not this one, I do a bit of web scraping. I do a lot of database work. And then I also, like I said, call people and interview them and talk to them. And I've talked to dozens and dozens of students for this series. So it's a lot of fun because I get to do a lot of different things.
It sounds to me, if you look at that data and you're pulling out things for your stories, but you probably also noticed there were some degree programs or maybe some college majors where you've consistently found some red flags. Can you give a warning to any of the education journalists out there where they need to be careful, keep their eyes open?
Yes. So if people are looking at this data on a local level, and first of all, I want to say if anyone wants to contact me, they can. And I'm happy to help. But looking at this data on a local level, I think there's a lot of untapped stories in it that we didn't get to. We're primarily focusing on elite graduate programs that, air quotes around elite, what that term actually means, but prestigious private universities. There's a lot of interesting stuff about for-profit schools that we didn't write about. There's a lot of interesting stuff about associate's degrees, and which actually have generally great debt to income ratios. And so there's a lot of other stuff out there, a lot of untapped story ideas. And I think looking for programs that have really high debt to income ratios is a pretty straightforward way of looking at it. With the Parent Plus data, looking at programs that have really high Parent Plus borrowing, especially for families whose children got Pell Grants. If you're a low-income family and you're earning $30,000 a year and you're borrowing $50,000 in Parent Plus debt, that's a lot of money. And for the Baylor story, we talked to some of those families.
How tough was it to get this data? I'm just curious, was there a lot of open records requests, or is most of the stuff you're talking about available to anybody who wants to look at it, provided they know how to crunch it?
It's the latter, actually. It wasn't available. I remember 10 years ago FOIAing this data from the education department when I worked at the Chronicle of Higher Education. And they said, this isn't available. We don't calculate any of this stuff. And which was a little troubling. I want to say that the government just didn't really know what the repayment rates were or the debt loads were for particular programs. A couple of years ago, under the Obama administration, they rolled out the College Scorecard, and they released a bunch of data that primarily dealt with undergraduates. But year before last, they released some data on graduate students, and this year they finally released the Parent Plus and Grad Plus repayment data. And that's when we at the Journal, and I was, like a kid in a candy store, said, oh my gosh, we have to do a series on this data. And so it's publicly available. Anybody can download it. It's a little difficult to work with. one of my colleagues at the Journal helped out on a story about journalism schools. And he had a lot of questions, and he's a very experienced data editor. And I would have to explain to him, oh, this is what this field means, and this is what this field means. So I kind of have a fluency in this data from working at the Chronicle of Higher Education. And I don't exclusively cover education. Again, jack of all trades. I've written about Google. I've written about Silicon Valley companies. I've written about charitable stock gifts. I've done a whole variety of things. But with education, I have a lot of knowledge in this area. And there's a really sort of dense data dictionary. This is actually thousands and thousands of fields. So it's difficult to work with, and it's structured in a sort of particularly unfriendly way. But there are ways you can download subsets of it and extracts. And again, if any reporters want to reach out to me or are interested in working with this data, I'm happy to lend a helping hand.
Well, let's go further on that. What advice do you have somebody who may want to become a data-focused reporter like yourself? What do you advise them to get out and do? And I'm wondering how you keep your own skills so sharp.
Repetition. It's all about repetition. I teach at Columbia Journalism School, and I tell my students all the time, you're not going to just learn this by osmosis of sitting in class and suddenly you've learned a fact. You have to do this over and over and over again. So getting really good at Excel is really valuable. I always tell people, build your Excel skills, learn to make a pivot table, sum and sort and filter. A lot of great data journalism can be done in Excel. With this data, I'm primarily working in what's called SQL. It's a database program, and that's sort of like a computer codey way of accessing the kind of stuff you would see in an Excel file, but you can write more complex queries of it that way. And so just layering on these skills is really valuable. And I don't think people need to go out and learn to web scrape right away. If you can make a pivot table, you are already further along than a lot of reporters. And I think that's a really, really, really valuable skill.
What are some story ideas you'd like to see local reporters tackling maybe more often around student debt issues?
I think what excited us so much about this series was holding universities to account. We saw it very much as an accountability series about what universities themselves are doing to contribute to the student debt crisis. I think a lot of what's written about student debt is either from purely borrower focused or purely Washington policy focused. And so I would encourage people in their own communities to hold universities to account for having out of whack debt loads with what students earn. I mean, tuitions, as we know, have increased far beyond inflation over the last couple decades. And it's only continuing, maybe not this year because inflation's so high, but for the most part, tuition is increasing much faster than either inflation or family earnings. And so we have a big college affordability problem. And I think holding colleges to account for their role in that is really powerful journalism.
Andrea Fuller is a journalist with the Wall Street Journal specializing in data analysis. Andrea, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.